Commander Sarah Chun pressed her palm against the cold metal wall of the underground bunker, feeling the vibrations from the orbital bombardment above. Each tremor sent dust cascading from the concrete ceiling, and the emergency lighting flickered with every impact. The hegemony had been pounding Earth for 72 hours straight, turning major cities into glass craters and reducing military installations to smoking ruins. "Ma'am, we're receiving another surrender demand from the hegemony fleet," Lieutenant Morrison reported from his communication station, his young face pale in the red emergency lighting. "Admiral Vextar is offering the same terms as before." Sarah didn't need to hear the terms again. Total submission, complete integration into their galactic empire. Humanity would become another servant species, their planet strip mined for resources, their children raised as laborers for alien masters. It was the same offer they'd given to 47 other species across the galaxy. 47 species that had all eventually accepted after seeing the futility of resistance. "Response, Commander?" Morrison asked, his fingers hovering over the transmission controls. Sarah looked around the command center at the faces of her remaining staff. They were exhausted, running on stimulants and determination alone. Outside this bunker, the surface world was burning. The North American defense grid had fallen 18 hours ago. The European Union's orbital platforms were debris fields. Asia's mountain fortresses had gone silent at dawn. By every tactical assessment, by every logical calculation, humanity should surrender. The hegemony's technology was centuries ahead of theirs. Their fleet numbered in the thousands of ships, each one capable of glassing a continent. Their ground forces were seasoned veterans who had conquered worlds before Earth's ancestors had even developed agriculture. But Sarah Chun had never been good at accepting the logical choice when it meant abandoning everything she'd sworn to protect. "Tell Admiral Vextar," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the bunker's communication system, "that humanity's answer remains the same. We refuse." A ripple of murmurs went through the command center, some of relief, others of barely contained fear. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he transmitted the message, knowing it would likely bring another wave of bombardment down upon them. The response came within minutes, Vextar's translated voice crackling through their speakers with barely contained frustration. "Commander Chun, your species continues to mystify the hegemony. We have demonstrated our overwhelming superiority. Your military assets are destroyed. Your population centers are ruins. What possible logic drives this continued resistance?" Sarah keyed the microphone herself this time. "Admiral, let me explain something about humans that your databases apparently missed. We have a saying on Earth: give me liberty or give me death. Some things matter more than survival." "This is irrational," Vextar replied immediately. "Your death serves no purpose. Your extinction benefits no one. Accept our terms, and your species will continue to exist within the hegemony structure." As slaves, Sarah shot back. As another conquered people stripped of their dignity, their culture, their freedom. "That's not existence, Admiral. That's just a slower form of death." The silence that followed stretched for long minutes. Sarah could imagine the alien commander consulting with his advisors, running probability calculations, trying to understand the psychological profile of a species that would choose annihilation over subjugation. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the bunker's chief scientist, approached Sarah's station with a data pad clutched in her weathered hands. "Commander, I need to show you something. We've been monitoring their fleet communications, and there's chatter we can't ignore." Sarah accepted the pad, scanning the translated intercepts. Her eyebrows rose as she read references to anomalous human behavior, unprecedented resistance patterns, and, most interesting of all, concerns about galactic stability implications. "What does this mean, Doctor?" Sarah asked. Elena's eyes lit up with the first spark of hope Sarah had seen in days. "It means we're making them nervous, Commander. Think about it. The hegemony has built their empire on a simple formula: demonstrate overwhelming force, demand surrender, integrate the conquered species. But we're not following the script." She pulled up another screen on the data pad, showing intercepted communications from other hegemony worlds. "Look at these reports from their occupied territories. Since news of Earth's resistance spread, they're seeing increased unrest among previously subjugated species. Work slowdowns, sabotage, organized protests. Some worlds that accepted surrender decades ago are starting to ask why they gave up so easily. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken as the implications sank in. We're not just fighting for Earth anymore. Exactly, Elena nodded vigorously. Every day we hold out, every time we refuse their demands, we're proving to the galaxy that the hegemony isn't invincible, that resistance is possible, that maybe, just maybe, freedom is worth fighting for even against impossible odds. The command center had gone quiet as the staff listened to Elena's briefing. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical thing. Humanity wasn't just deciding its own fate anymore. They'd become a symbol, a beacon of defiance for species across the galaxy who had forgotten what it meant to stand up for themselves. Morrison's communication board chimed with another incoming message. Commander, we're receiving a transmission, but it's not from the hegemony fleet. The origin point is, I'm not sure how this is possible, but it's coming from the Kepler system. Sarah frowned. The Kepler system had been conquered by the hegemony 8 years ago. The native Keplerian species had surrendered after a brief resistance and had been fully integrated into the Empire structure. There shouldn't be any independent communications coming from that region of space. Put it through, Sarah ordered. The voice that came through their speakers was unlike anything they heard before. It was melodic, almost musical, with harmonics that suggested the speaker had multiple vocal cords. But the words, translated by their linguistic computers, were clear enough. Brave humans of Earth, this message comes from the underground resistance on Kepler Prime. For 8 cycles we have labored under hegemony rule, believing ourselves alone in our desire for freedom. But your defiance has shown us that the spirit of liberty still burns in the galaxy. Know that you are not alone. Know that others watch and draw courage from your example. The message was brief, lasting only a few minutes, but its impact was profound. Sarah could see the change in her staff's faces, the way their shoulders straightened and their eyes regained focus. They weren't just the last desperate remnants of a doomed species anymore. They were part of something larger. Elena was already working at her station, cross-referencing the transmission with their intelligence databases. Commander, if the Keplerians have maintained a resistance network for 8 years without the hegemony detecting it, that suggests their control isn't as absolute as they claim. If there are others, then our resistance might be the spark that lights a galactic rebellion, Sarah finished. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the potential. Another tremor shook the bunker as the hegemony's bombardment continued above. But now, instead of feeling like the death throes of a dying world, each impact felt like a declaration. Humanity would not go quietly into servitude. They would fight, they would resist, and they would show the galaxy what defiance looked like. Sarah returned to her command station and opened a channel to all remaining human military installations worldwide. She knew most of them were gone, reduced to rubble and radioactive ash. But there were others, hidden bunkers like this one, submarine bases in the deep ocean, mountain fortresses carved in a solid rock. Scattered groups of soldiers, civilians, and scientists who had refused to surrender. This is Commander Chun broadcasting on all emergency frequencies. She began, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. I'm transmitting from Deep Site 7, and we are still operational. We are still fighting, and we are not alone. She shared the Keplerian message, reading it word for word to ensure everyone heard the full impact. The responses began coming in immediately. Weak signals from installations she'd thought were destroyed, confirming they were still active. Underground networks she hadn't known existed, reporting they were ready to continue the fight. Even civilian groups holed up in subway tunnels and abandoned mines, declaring their refusal to surrender. The hegemony offers us slavery disguised as peace, Sarah continued. They promise us survival in exchange for everything that makes us human. But they've made one critical error in their calculations. They don't understand what drives us. They don't comprehend the value we place on freedom. They can't grasp that some things are worth dying for. She paused, looking around the command center at her people, then at the data streaming in from resistance groups across the globe. So we're going to teach them. We're going to show them and every conquered species in the galaxy what human defiance looks like. We're going to prove that liberty isn't just a luxury to be abandoned when times get hard. It's the core of what makes life worth living. The bombardment above intensified, as if the hegemony fleet had heard her broadcast and responded with increased fury. But down in the bunker, surrounded by the steady hum of life support systems and the quiet determination of her people, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since the invasion began. Hope. Elena appeared at her shoulder again, this time with a different kind of urgency in her expression. Commander, our deep space monitoring stations picked up something before they went dark. Long-range sensor readings suggest the hegemony isn't just dealing with us anymore. There are reports of fleet movements toward the Centauri system, the vegan territories, even the core worlds near their capital. Rebellions? Sarah asked. Or the fear of them? Elena replied. Our resistance is forcing them to spread their forces thin, to reinforce worlds they thought were secure. Every ship they send to deal with uprisings elsewhere is one less ship bombarding Earth. Sarah nodded, understanding the strategic implications. The longer humanity held out, the more time other species would have to organize their own resistance movements. The more resources the hegemony would have to commit to maintaining control over their existing territories. The more cracks would appear in what had seemed like an unshakable empire. Morrison's voice cut through her thoughts. Commander, Admiral Vextar is requesting another communication channel. He says it's urgent. Put him through, Sarah replied, curious what new threats or offers the alien commander might have. Vextar's voice, when it came through their speakers, carried a different tone than before. Less confident, more frustrated. Commander Chun, I will be direct. Your continued resistance is causing complications throughout hegemony space. We are prepared to offer revised terms for your surrender. I'm listening, Sarah said, though she had no intention of accepting any terms that involve subjugation. We will designate Earth as a protected world within the hegemony structure. Your people will be allowed to maintain limited self-governance, cultural practices, and territorial integrity. In exchange, you will provide technological expertise and cease all resistance activities. Sarah exchanged glances with Elena, who was already shaking her head. It was a better offer than they'd received before, but it still meant accepting alien overlordship. Still meant giving up their independence. Still meant teaching their children to bow to foreign masters. Admiral Vextar, Sarah replied, let me ask you something. In all your conquests, in all the worlds you've brought into the hegemony, has any species ever said no to that offer? There was a pause before Vextar answered. None have been offered such generous terms. That's not what I asked, Sarah pressed. I asked if any species has ever said no. Has any conquered people ever told the mighty hegemony that freedom isn't negotiable? That dignity isn't for sale? That some things matter more than survival? Another longer pause. When Vextar spoke again, his voice was quieter. No species has made such a choice. Then, you're about to learn something new about the universe, Admiral, Sarah said, her voice carrying throughout the bunker and beyond to every human settlement still listening. You're about to discover what happens when an entire species decides that liberty or death isn't just a slogan. It's a promise. She cut the transmission before Vextar could respond, turning to address her command staff. All units, prepare for escalated bombardment. They're going to try to break us with raw firepower now that their psychology has failed. But remember, every minute we hold out is another minute for resistance movements across the galaxy to organize. Every hour we survive is proof that the hegemony can be defied. As if summoned by her words, the bunker shook with the most violent tremor yet, dust and small debris raining down from the ceiling. But nobody moved from their stations. Nobody suggested surrender. They had made their choice, and they would see it through to whatever end awaited them. In the days and weeks to come, Sarah knew the true test of human defiance would begin. The hegemony would throw everything they had at Earth, determined to crush this unprecedented resistance before it could spread further. But humanity had already achieved something no other species had managed. They had said no to an empire that had never heard that word before. And across the galaxy, on world after conquered world, other species were beginning to whisper a word they had almost forgotten: freedom. 3 weeks after humanity's final refusal to surrender, the hegemony's bombardment had evolved from indiscriminate destruction to surgical strikes. Admiral Vextar had learned that simply reducing the planet to molten rock would eliminate the very thing he was trying to suppress: the example of human resistance. The galaxy was watching, and turning Earth into a lifeless ball of slag would only prove that the hegemony's generous offers of integration were worthless. Deep Sight 7 had survived longer than anyone expected, though the bunker bore scars from the constant assault. Water leaked through stress fractures in the walls, the air recycling system wheezed with overwork, and 3 of their 8 backup generators had failed. Commander Sarah Chun had moved her primary operations to the deepest level, where the original missile silos had been converted into a nerve center for the Global Resistance Network. "Status report," Sarah called out as she descended the metal stairs into the operations center. The space hummed with activity despite their dwindling numbers. Half her original staff was gone, evacuated to other facilities when their positions became untenable, or simply lost when sections of the bunker collapsed under bombardment. Lieutenant Morrison looked up from his communication station, dark circles under his eyes testimony to weeks of survival on stimulants and determination. "We've maintained contact with 17 resistance cells worldwide, Commander." The Australian underground reports successful sabotage of hegemony ground installations near Sydney. "The Scandinavian Mountain Network has been feeding intelligence to our submarine fleet." And he paused, glancing at Dr. Elena Vasquez, who nodded encouragingly. "And we've received 43 separate communications from resistance movements in 12 different star systems. The rebellion is spreading, ma'am." Sarah felt that familiar surge of pride mixed with terror. Each success brought hope, but also escalated the stakes. Humanity wasn't just fighting for their own survival anymore. They had become a catalyst for a galactic uprising that could either liberate countless worlds or result in their complete annihilation. Elena approached with her ever-present datapad, but this time her expression carried something Sarah had learned to recognize: the look of someone who had discovered something that changed everything. "Commander, we've been analyzing the pattern of hegemony fleet movements over the past week," Elena began, pulling up a holographic display of local space. "They're not just responding to our resistance anymore. They're actively repositioning forces to deal with uprisings on 17 different worlds." The hologram showed the familiar bulk of the hegemony invasion fleet, but now Sarah could see that nearly a third of the ships had moved to defensive positions around their communication relay stations. Others had departed entirely, leaving only the core bombardment group to continue the assault on Earth. "More importantly," Elena continued, "we've intercepted communications suggesting they're dealing with something they never expected: coordinated resistance. The various species aren't just rebelling individually anymore. They're sharing intelligence, coordinating attacks, learning from our tactics." Sarah studied the display, noting the strategic implications. "How many ships are left in Earth orbit?" "Approximately 60% of the original invasion force," Morrison reported. "Still more than enough to glass the planet, but not enough to prevent the kind of surgical infiltration our submarine forces have been conducting." As if to emphasize his point, Morrison's communication board lit up with an incoming transmission from the Pacific Deep Strike Group. Captain Maria Santos's voice crackled through the speakers, distorted by the electromagnetic interference from the ongoing bombardment, but unmistakably excited. "Deep Sight 7, this is Barracuda Actual. We've successfully penetrated the hegemony's orbital picket line and deployed the packages. Repeat, the packages are in position and ready for activation on your command." Sarah exchanged glances with Elena. The packages were humanity's most desperate gambit, a plan so audacious that even their own military analysts had given it only a 15% chance of success. Using modified submarine-launched missiles, they had managed to position small teams of volunteers aboard several hegemony vessels. The teams carried with them the most dangerous weapon humanity possessed, not nuclear warheads or plasma charges, but something far more subversive. Barracuda Actual. This is Chun. Confirm package contents and team status. Package contents confirmed. Full database of human history, philosophy, literature, and cultural records translated into standard galactic languages. Teams report successful infiltration of ship networks with minimal resistance. The hegemony apparently didn't expect anyone to be crazy enough to try boarding their vessels. Elena smiled grimly. They still don't understand humans, do they? The plan was simple in concept, revolutionary in execution. Rather than trying to destroy the hegemony ships through force, they were infecting them with something far more dangerous: ideas. The volunteers who had risked everything to board those vessels were uploading humanity's entire cultural and philosophical heritage directly into the hegemony's computer networks. Every poem ever written about freedom, every song that celebrated the dignity of the individual, every philosophical treatise that argued for the rights of sentient beings to determine their own destiny, every story of ordinary people standing up to tyranny and winning against impossible odds. Execute package deployment, Sarah ordered. All teams begin cultural data transfer. What happened next would either be remembered as the moment humanity doomed itself, or the day they gave the galaxy the most powerful weapon of all, the knowledge that freedom was possible. Across the hegemony fleet, alien crew members working routine shifts suddenly found their computer terminals displaying strange new data. Ship security officers investigating unauthorized network access instead found themselves reading translated excerpts from human literature. Communications technicians tasked with jamming Earth's transmissions discovered databases filled with music that spoke to universal emotions of hope and defiance. The infection spread through the ship networks faster than the hegemony's digital security systems could contain it. Not because the human code was particularly sophisticated, but because it was designed to be shared. Every file contained instructions for copying and distribution. Every document included links to related materials. The humans had turned their own culture into a virus, and it was spreading through the fleet like wildfire. Admiral Vexstar's angry voice filled the command center as he opened an emergency channel to Earth. Commander Chin, what have you done? Our ship networks are experiencing unprecedented infiltration. Cease this attack immediately. Sarah took her time responding, savoring what might be her last moment of tactical superiority. Admiral, what you're experiencing isn't an attack. It's education. Your crews are learning about concepts you've apparently never encountered. Individual rights, democratic governance, the philosophical foundations of freedom. Consider it a gift. This is information warfare of the most insidious type. Vextar sputeriet. You're contaminating our personnel with subversive ideological content. We call it culture, Sarah replied calmly. Though I understand the concepts might be foreign to species raised under authoritarian rule. Elena was monitoring the hegemony fleet communications, her eyes widening as she tracked the spread of the cultural download. Commander, it's working beyond our wildest projections. They're not just accessing our files, they're sharing them with each other. Ship-to-ship transfers, personal message exchanges, even official communications are carrying fragments of human literature and philosophy. Morrison looked up from his station with amazement. Ma'am, we're receiving reports from our galactic contacts. The cultural transmission isn't stopping at the Earth fleet. Ships returning to hegemony space are carrying the data with them. It's spreading to their core worlds. Sarah felt a chill of realization. They had just unleashed something that couldn't be contained or recalled. Human ideas about freedom, individual rights, and democratic governance were now spreading through the most authoritarian empire the galaxy had ever known. The consequences would be either liberating or catastrophic on a scale beyond imagination. The immediate effects were already becoming apparent. Elena's instruments detected increasing communication between ships that had previously maintained strict operational silence. Crew schedules were being disrupted as personnel spent time accessing and discussing the new information. Most significantly, several ships had begun requesting permission to withdraw from bombardment duties to address network security concerns. Admiral Vextar, Sarah transmitted, I noticed some of your ships are showing reduced activity. Is everything functioning properly? The silence that greeted her question lasted nearly 5 minutes. When Vextar finally responded, his voice carried a tension that hadn't been there before. Commander Chun, this infection you have introduced will be contained and eliminated. The hegemony has dealt with seditious materials before. Have you? Sarah asked genuinely. Because our intelligence suggests that you maintain control through information restriction and cultural suppression. You've never had to deal with voluntary exposure to alternative philosophical frameworks. Your crews aren't being forced to read our literature, Admiral. They're choosing to. Elena held up her datapad, showing real-time communication intercepts from the hegemony fleet. The content was remarkable. Crew members sharing translated passages from human poetry, discussing concepts like individual dignity and consensual government, asking questions about societies where leaders were chosen by popular vote rather than military conquest. More disturbing to the hegemony command structure, questions were arising about their own civilization. If humans could create literature about the inherent worth of every individual, why did the hegemony treat most of its citizens as disposable labor? If human societies could function through cooperative decision-making, why did the hegemony require absolute obedience to distant authorities? The questioning spread beyond philosophical discussions. Crew members began examining their own conditions with new perspective. Why did they work 20-hour shifts while their officers enjoyed comfortable quarters? Why were their homeworlds strip-mined to support the luxury of the capital planets? Why had their species never been offered the generous terms now being extended to humanity? Commander, Morrison reported, his voice carrying barely contained excitement. We're detecting significant discord in the fleet communications. Multiple ships are reporting disciplinary problems, work slowdowns, and formal grievance filings. Admiral Vextar's flagship is issuing increasingly desperate orders for information quarantine. Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The hegemony had built their empire on the assumption that conquered species would accept subjugation as inevitable. They had never encountered a people who viewed freedom as non-negotiable, and they certainly hadn't prepared for the possibility that their own forces might be exposed to such radical concepts. But the tactical situation remained precarious. While the cultural infection was causing disruption in the enemy fleet, the hegemony still possessed overwhelming firepower. If Vextar decided that Earth represented too great a threat to galactic stability, he could still reduce the planet to radioactive ash. As if reading her thoughts, Elena pointed to her instruments. Commander, we're detecting massive power signatures from the flagship. They're charging their planetary bombardment systems to maximum capacity. The implication was clear. Admiral Vextar had decided that containing the spread of human ideas was worth destroying the source. Earth was about to face the full fury of weapons designed to crack continents and boil oceans. Sarah opened channels to all remaining human resistance forces. All units, this is Commander Chun. We're detecting preparation for full-scale planetary bombardment. Execute Lazarus Protocol immediately. Repeat, execute Lazarus Protocol. The Lazarus Protocol was humanity's final contingency, a desperate plan to preserve something of their civilization even if Earth was destroyed. Deep in oceanic trenches, mountain bunkers, and hidden facilities across the solar system, automated systems began uploading compressed archives of human culture, history, and knowledge to small stealth probes. If Earth died, these tiny vessels would carry the essence of humanity to distant stars, ensuring that their story survived even if they did not. But Sarah wasn't ready to accept extinction just yet. The cultural infection had given them one last tactical option, dangerous and untested but potentially decisive. Elena, are our boarding teams still operational? Sarah asked. 3 teams confirm ready status, Elena replied. They're reporting that ship security has broken down significantly. Crew members are more interested in discussing human philosophy than maintaining defensive protocols. Sarah made the decision that would either save humanity or doom them. All teams, execute Phase 2. Upload the revolutionary protocols. If the cultural database had been humanity's gift to the galaxy, the revolutionary protocols were their declaration of war against tyranny itself. Unlike the philosophical and artistic materials they had already distributed, these files contained practical information: how to organize resistance movements, how to communicate securely under authoritarian surveillance, how to conduct sabotage operations, how to build democratic institutions from the ground up. The protocols were based on humanity's own history of resistance to oppression, from ancient slave revolts to modern liberation movements. They provided step-by-step instructions for everything from organizing work strikes to establishing underground railways for political refugees. Most importantly, they included detailed intelligence about the hegemony's own vulnerabilities, gathered through weeks of monitoring their communications and analyzing their tactical responses. The humans had learned much about their enemy's weaknesses, and now they were sharing that knowledge with every species under hegemony rule. Admiral Vextar's response was immediate and furious. "Commander Chun, you have committed an act of galactic terrorism. These revolutionary instructions will be used by criminal elements throughout the Empire to destabilize legitimate authority." Sarah's reply carried the weight of her species' final judgment on the hegemony's concept of legitimacy. "Admiral, the only criminal element I see is an empire that conquers free peoples and forces them into slavery. If our information helps them reclaim their birthright of liberty, then we consider that a victory regardless of what happens to Earth." The power readings from the hegemony flagship spiked as their bombardment systems reached full charge. In minutes, perhaps seconds, weapons capable of splitting continents would reduce Earth to molten slag. But across the galaxy, the revolutionary protocols were spreading from ship to ship, system to system, world to world. The age of the hegemony's unchallenged dominion was ending, and a new era of galactic freedom was about to begin. Whether humanity would survive to see it remained to be determined. The planetary bombardment that should have ended Earth's resistance never came. Instead, Admiral Vextar found himself dealing with something the hegemony had never encountered in 5 centuries of galactic conquest: mutiny within his own fleet. It began subtly aboard the dreadnought Eternal Dominion when Chief Engineer Crixtal, a member of the subjugated Altarian species, refused to initialize the planetary bombardment sequence. When questioned by security forces, Crixtal simply quoted a passage from a human document known as the Declaration of Independence. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Within hours, the refusal had spread throughout the ship's engineering sections. Altarian crew members, who had served the hegemony faithfully for 30 years since their world's conquest, began asking questions that chilled their overseers to the bone. Why should they participate in destroying a world whose only crime was refusing to surrender its freedom? How was their own situation different from the humans they were being ordered to kill? Commander Sarah Chun learned of the fleet's crisis through intercepted communications that Morrison's team had decoded. The irony was bitter and beautiful. The hegemony's own rigid communication protocols, designed to maintain absolute control, were now broadcasting their weakness across all monitored frequencies. "Commander, you need to hear this," Morrison called out, his voice tight with amazement. He played back a transmission from the hegemony flagship, Admiral Vextar's words crackling through the speakers with barely controlled panic. "All ship commanders report to secure channels immediately. We have multiple incidents of crew insubordination spreading throughout the fleet. The human contamination has exceeded all projected parameters. Request immediate deployment of loyalty enforcement squads to all affected vessels." Elena looked up from her analysis station, her eyes bright with the first real hope Sarah had seen since the invasion began. "Commander, they're losing control, not just of the situation, but of their own people. The cultural protocols we deployed aren't just changing minds, they're changing hearts." Sarah moved to the central communications console, studying the real-time intelligence streaming in from their monitoring stations. The scope of the crisis was staggering. 7 ships had reported complete work stoppages as crew members demanded explanations for the fleet's mission. 3 more had experienced what the hegemony was calling philosophical debates, but which sounded more like religious awakenings as subjugated species encountered concepts of inherent dignity and self-determination for the first time in generations. Most significantly, the heavy cruiser subjugation's edge had gone completely silent after its crew, composed primarily of the conquered Keplerian species, had declared their intention to withdraw from participation in tyrannical actions pending resolution of ethical concerns. "Open a channel to the hegemony fleet," Sarah ordered. "All frequencies. I want every ship to hear this." Morrison's hands flew over his controls, establishing the broadest possible transmission pattern. When he nodded confirmation, Sarah began to speak, knowing that her words would reach not just Admiral Vextar, but every member of every crew in the invasion force. "This is Commander Sarah Chan of the Human Defense Forces, broadcasting to all hegemony personnel. We know that many of you are struggling with questions that your leaders never prepared you to face. Questions about justice, about freedom, about the kind of galaxy you want to leave for your children." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle across the void between hostile fleets. "We know because we've seen the reports. We know that Alteri engineers are refusing to fire on civilian populations. We know that Keplerian navigators are questioning orders to bombard schools and hospitals. We know that crew members across your fleet are rediscovering something your empire tried to take from them. The knowledge that every sentient being has the right to determine their own destiny." Admiral Vextar's voice cut across the transmission almost immediately. "All crews will disregard this propaganda and return to duty stations. Any further insubordination will be met with immediate disciplinary action." But Sarah continued speaking, her voice calm and steady, carrying the authority of someone who had already chosen to die for her principles. "To the Alterians listening, your homeworld produced some of the galaxy's greatest poets before the conquest. Did you know that? Your pre-invasion literature speaks of freedom as the fundamental right of all thinking beings. The hegemony tried to erase that knowledge, but it survives in the archives we've shared with you." Morrison was monitoring the fleet communications, his face showing growing amazement. "Commander, we're detecting massive spikes in intership communication. They're not just listening, they're talking to each other." Sarah pressed on. "To the Keplerians, your species developed the first truly democratic government in this galactic sector. Your ancestors created systems of consensual leadership that lasted for millennia before the hegemony's conquest. That knowledge, that heritage, belongs to you. It was never the Empire's to take away." Elena's instruments showed the truth of what was happening throughout the hegemony fleet. The cultural downloads hadn't just provided information. They had given the subjugated species something far more powerful: context for their own stolen histories. Many of these civilizations have been democratic, peaceful, creative societies before their conquest. The hegemony had systematically erased that knowledge, replacing it with propaganda about the benefits of imperial order. Now, for the first time in decades, crew members were remembering what their worlds had been like before the conquest. They were rediscovering cultural traditions, philosophical frameworks, and political systems their own grandparents had considered normal and natural. "All ship commanders, implement emergency communication protocols," Vextar ordered over the fleet channels. "Cut all unauthorized transmissions and isolate affected crew members." But it was too late. The revolutionary protocols that humanity's boarding teams had uploaded contained more than just philosophical materials. They included practical instructions for organizing resistance movements, including how to maintain communication networks under authoritarian suppression. Morrison's monitoring station lit up with dozens of new signals as hegemony crew members activated encrypted communication channels, sharing information and coordinating responses across the fleet. The very systems the Empire used to maintain control were being turned against it. "Commander," Elena reported, her voice filled with awe, "we're receiving a direct transmission from the cruiser's subjugation's edge. They're requesting formal communication with Earth's government." Sarah felt her heart race. A hegemony warship was requesting diplomatic contact with the planet they had come to conquer. The implications were staggering. "Put them through," she ordered. The voice that came through the speakers was melodic and complex, characteristic of the Keplerian vocal structure. But the words, translated through their linguistic computers, carried a gravity that transcended species barriers. Commander Chun, this is Navigator Veltar of the vessel Subjugation's Edge, speaking for a crew that has voted to withdraw from hostile operations against Earth. We have reviewed the cultural materials your people shared with our fleet, and we wish to formally request political asylum for our crew and our ship. Sarah exchanged glances with Elena and Morrison. They were being asked to grant asylum to enemy combatants who had experienced a philosophical awakening. It was unprecedented in the history of warfare. Navigator Veltar, this is Commander Chun. On what grounds do you request asylum? We request asylum on the grounds that participation in the conquest of free peoples violates our fundamental ethical obligations as sentient beings, Veltar replied. We have been reminded, through your cultural archives, that our own species once cherished the principles you defend. We cannot in conscience continue to deny others what was stolen from us. Admiral Vextar's voice erupted across all channels simultaneously. Crew of Subjugation's Edge, you are ordered to return to formation and resume assigned duties. This philosophical contamination will be contained and corrected through proper therapeutic intervention. Veltar's response was immediate and devastating. Admiral, with respect, the crew of this vessel has voted unanimously to reject further participation in what we now recognize as war crimes. We formally request that all hegemony forces withdraw from this system and allow the human species to determine their own governance. Sarah realized she was witnessing the birth of something entirely new, a galactic civil rights movement. The cultural materials humanity had shared weren't just spreading information. They were awakening entire species to the realization that their current situation was neither natural nor acceptable. Elena's instruments detected new developments throughout the fleet. Commander, we're seeing similar declarations from crews on 4 more ships. The heavy cruiser Ordained Conquest has gone to minimum power and withdrawn from bombardment formation. The destroyer-class's Final Answer and Inevitable Submission are reporting technical difficulties that prevent them from targeting Earth's surface. Morrison's communication board was lighting up with incoming signals from across the galaxy. Ma'am, we're receiving transmissions from 17 different star systems. Resistance movements that have been dormant for decades are activating. The revolution is spreading faster than the hegemony can respond. Sarah opened a channel to Admiral Vextar directly. Admiral, I believe your situation has changed significantly since we last spoke. Would you care to discuss revised terms for ending this conflict? The silence that followed lasted for several minutes. When Vextar finally responded, his voice carried a defeat that no amount of military firepower could have achieved. Commander Chun, the Hegemony Council has been informed of the complications arising from your psychological warfare campaign. We are suspending offensive operations pending review of the strategic situation. Elena was already analyzing the implications. Commander, if they're suspending operations, it means the revolution has spread beyond what they can contain. They're not just dealing with a few mutinous crews anymore. They're facing systematic resistance throughout their empire. Sarah felt the weight of history settling around her. Humanity's refusal to surrender had accomplished something no military victory could have achieved. It had reminded an entire galaxy that freedom was possible, that tyranny was not the natural order of the universe, that ordinary beings, working together, could resist even the most overwhelming oppression. But the most important test still lay ahead. The hegemony might have suspended their assault on Earth, but they still possessed thousands of ships and centuries of experience in suppressing rebellions. The question now was whether the awakened species could maintain their newfound unity in the face of the inevitable counterattack. Navigator Veltar's voice came through the speakers again, addressing not just Earth but the entire fleet. To all crew members of all ships, we propose an immediate ceasefire and the establishment of diplomatic negotiations between the hegemony command structure and representatives of all species currently serving in their forces. The time has come to address the fundamental questions of governance, consent, and individual rights that this conflict has raised. Admiral Vextar's response was swift and harsh. Negative. The hegemony does not negotiate with rebellious elements. All crews will return to standard operational protocols or face disciplinary action. But Veltar had allies now. Voices from across the fleet began responding, each one representing a crew that had chosen principle over orders. Altari engineers, Keplerian navigators, vegan communication specialists, and dozens of other species that had served the Empire faithfully for generations. All of them now saying the same word that humanity had introduced to galactic politics. No. The word echoed across the communication channels, repeated in dozens of languages, but carrying the same fundamental meaning. No, they would not participate in the destruction of free peoples. No, they would not accept that might makes right. No, they would not surrender their rediscovered dignity for the promise of security. Sarah realized that humanity's greatest victory was not in saving themselves, but in teaching the galaxy that resistance was possible. That ordinary people could stand up to impossible odds and win, not through superior firepower, but through the simple recognition that some things are worth any sacrifice. The war for Earth's freedom had become something far greater, the galaxy's first real chance for universal liberation in centuries. And it had all started with a single word that the hegemony had never heard before humanity spoke it. 6 weeks after humanity's cultural revolution began spreading through the hegemony fleet, the political situation had evolved beyond anyone's wildest projections. What had started as a desperate act of defiance by a single planet had become a galaxy-spanning crisis that threatened the very foundations of the Empire's authority. Commander Sarah Chun stood in the newly established Diplomatic Operations Center, carved out from Deep Site 7's former armory. The space buzzed with activity as human negotiators worked alongside representatives from 17 different species, all of whom had arrived aboard ships that had defected from the hegemony fleet. The irony was not lost on anyone. Earth's most secure military bunker had become the galaxy's first truly multi-species democratic assembly. Status report from the Galactic Coordination Committee, Dr. Elena Vasquez announced, consulting her datapad as she approached Sarah's command station. The title was grandiose for what was essentially a collection of former enemy combatants and resistance leaders, but it represented something unprecedented in galactic history: voluntary cooperation between species based on shared principles rather than imposed authority. The vegan territories have declared independence from the hegemony, Elena continued. That makes 37 systems in open rebellion, with coordinated resistance movements active in 63 others. More significantly, the hegemony's communication networks are reporting systematic data corruption as our cultural protocols continue to spread through their computer systems. Sarah nodded, studying the holographic display that dominated the center of the room. The galaxy map showed the hegemony's territory in traditional imperial red, but now it was scattered with green indicators representing free systems, yellow zones where rebellions were active, and ominous orange areas where the Empire had lost communication entirely. What about Admiral Vextar's response to our latest diplomatic proposal? Sarah asked. Lieutenant Morrison looked up from his communication station, his expression grim. The Admiral refuses to acknowledge the legitimacy of our coalition government. He's demanding that all defected ships return to hegemony space immediately, and he's threatening to declare Earth a contaminated zone subject to sterilization protocols. Sarah felt the familiar chill that came with facing extinction-level threats. Despite their unprecedented success in sparking galactic rebellion, Earth remained vulnerable. While many ships had defected from the invasion fleet, enough remained under hegemony control to reduce the planet to radioactive ash if Vextar chose to escalate. Navigator Veltar of the former hegemony vessel Subjugation's Edge approached the command station. In the weeks since his ship's defection, the Keplerian officer had become one of Earth's most valuable allies, providing crucial intelligence about hegemony military doctrine and political structure. Commander Chun, I bring disturbing news from our intelligence network, Veltar said, his melodic voice carrying undertones of urgency. The Hegemony High Council has dispatched the Imperial Enforcement Fleet to this sector. Admiral Zarketh is commanding the operation personally. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Every species in the galaxy knew the reputation of Admiral Zarketh and his enforcement fleet. They were the hegemony's ultimate solution to problems that couldn't be resolved through conventional military action. When rebellious worlds proved too stubborn to subdue, when conquered species forgot their place in the Imperial Order, Zarketh was sent to remind them why the hegemony had ruled unchallenged for centuries. Elena was already accessing their intelligence databases. Commander, Admiral Zarketh's fleet includes 12 planet-killer dreadnoughts and support vessels numbering in the hundreds. They specialize in what the hegemony calls comprehensive pacification operations. The euphemism was chilling. Comprehensive pacification meant the complete destruction of a world's military capacity, economic infrastructure, and civilian government, followed by the systematic replacement of the native population with loyal hegemony colonists. It was genocide disguised as administrative efficiency. How long until they arrive? Sarah asked. Veltar consulted his personal data device, performing rapid calculations. Based on standard enforcement fleet travel protocols, approximately 18 standard days. However, Admiral Zarketh is known for arriving ahead of schedule to maximize the psychological impact of his operations. Sarah turned to address the assembled coalition representatives. The group included former hegemony officers, resistance leaders from conquered worlds, and newly elected representatives from the liberated systems. It was the most diverse gathering of free peoples the galaxy had seen in centuries, united by their shared commitment to the principles humanity had reintroduced to galactic politics. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings, Sarah began, using the inclusive address formula they had developed to accommodate the various species' cultural preferences. We face a decisive moment. The hegemony has chosen to respond to our liberation movement with their most extreme measures. Admiral Zarketh's enforcement fleet represents everything we have been fighting against. The belief that freedom is a privilege to be granted or revoked by distant authorities. Counselor Tishisara, a representative of the recently liberated Serpentine worlds, raised one of her 4 hands to request recognition. Commander Chun, our intelligence suggests that Admiral Zarketh's fleet is approximately 10 times larger than all our combined forces. What strategic options do we possess against such overwhelming military superiority? It was the question that had haunted Sarah's thoughts for days. In pure military terms, the coalition stood no chance against the enforcement fleet. But then, again, Earth had stood no chance against Admiral Vextar's invasion force, and that perceived impossibility had led to the greatest psychological victory in galactic history. Counselor Tishisara raises the crucial point, Sarah replied. We cannot defeat Admiral Zarketh through conventional military engagement, but we have already proven that there are forms of victory that transcend battlefield superiority. The question is whether we can scale our cultural resistance tactics to match the scope of this new threat. Elena stepped forward, her data pad displaying the results of their latest analysis. Commander, we've been studying the composition of Admiral Zarketh's fleet, and we've discovered something significant. Unlike Admiral Vextar's invasion force, which was primarily composed of conquered species serving under hegemony officers, the enforcement fleet includes substantial numbers of core world personnel. Sarah frowned. What's the significance of that distinction? Core world citizens have been raised from birth to believe in the righteousness of the hegemony system, Elena explained. They've never experienced conquest or subjugation personally. Their loyalty isn't based on fear or resignation. It's based on genuine conviction that the Empire represents order, prosperity, and civilization. Veltar nodded agreement. Dr. Vasquez is correct. Core worlders view the hegemony as a benevolent force that brings peace and stability to chaotic regions of space. They see resistance movements as terrorist organizations that threaten the security of law-abiding citizens throughout the galaxy. Sarah began to see the implications. So, our cultural protocols, which were designed to awaken subjugated species to the possibility of freedom, might not have the same effect on people who already consider themselves free. Exactly, Elena confirmed. We need a different approach. Instead of showing them what freedom looks like, we need to show them what their empire actually costs. Over the next several days, the Coalition's best minds worked to develop what they codenamed the Transparency Protocols. Unlike the cultural materials that had sparked the rebellion among conquered species, these new data packages focused on information the hegemony had hidden from its own core world citizens. The protocols included detailed records of the Empire's conquest campaigns, showing the civilian casualties and cultural destruction that accompanied each integration operation. They contained economic analyses demonstrating how the wealth of conquered worlds was extracted to subsidize the comfortable lifestyle of core world populations. Most damning of all, they included recorded communications between hegemony leadership, revealing the cynical calculations behind their public rhetoric of bringing civilization to backward species. The key, Elena explained to the assembled Coalition Council, is that everything in the Transparency Protocols is information from the hegemony's own records. We're not asking core worlders to believe human propaganda. We're asking them to confront documentation from their own government that contradicts everything they've been told about the Empire's noble mission. Sarah studied the completed protocols on her personal display. The material was comprehensive, carefully documented, and utterly devastating to any honest examination of the hegemony's claims to moral authority. If core world citizens were truly committed to justice and civilization, exposure to this information should force them to confront the reality of what their comfortable lives actually cost. The question is delivery, Sarah said. Admiral Vextar's fleet was vulnerable to our boarding operations because their crews were already questioning their orders. Zarketh's people are true believers. They won't make the same security mistakes. Captain Maria Santos, recently returned from her submarine forces, had been quietly listening to the discussion. Now she spoke up with the confidence of someone who had successfully penetrated enemy defenses multiple times. Commander, we don't need to board their ships to deliver the protocols. We just need to get close enough for electronic transmission. She activated her portable display, showing a tactical schematic of the Coalition's remaining military assets. We have 37 vessels of various classes, all crewed by people who have already chosen principle over safety. If we coordinate a simultaneous transmission burst from all ships at the moment of first contact with the enforcement fleet, we can flood their communication networks with the transparency protocols before they can implement countermeasures. Sarah considered the proposal. It was tactically sound but operationally suicidal. The Coalition ships would have to approach close enough to Admiral Zarketh's fleet for effective data transmission, well within the range of weapons that could vaporize their vessels in seconds. Captain Santos, you're proposing that our entire fleet sacrifice itself for the chance to deliver information packets to an enemy force, Sarah said. Even if the protocols have their intended effect, none of our people would survive to see the results. Santos nodded grimly. Yes, Commander, but if we succeed, the core worlds will learn the truth about what their empire has been doing in their name. And if we fail, we'll still have sent a message that some principles are worth dying for. The Coalition Council fell silent as the implication settled. They were discussing the sacrifice of thousands of beings who had already risked everything to oppose tyranny. It was a heavy responsibility, but Sarah realized it was also the natural culmination of the path they had chosen when humanity first refused to surrender. Counselor Tichwisisara broke the silence. Commander Chun, the Serpentine Worlds volunteer our 3 ships for this operation. Our people have already voted unanimously to accept any risk necessary to ensure that future generations grow up free. Similar declarations followed from every species represented in the coalition. The Alterians, whose poets had inspired the first stirrings of rebellion in Admiral Vextar's fleet. The Keplerians, whose democratic traditions had provided the philosophical framework for interspecies cooperation. The Vegans, whose recent liberation had demonstrated that successful resistance was possible. Even species Sarah had never heard of before the rebellion began, peoples whose worlds had been conquered so long ago that their names had been nearly forgotten by galactic history. All of them choosing to risk extinction for the chance to share truth with their oppressors. Sarah felt the weight of command settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. These beings were placing their faith in humanity's judgment, trusting that the species that had sparked this rebellion knew how to bring it to a successful conclusion. All coalition commanders, Sarah announced, prepare your vessels for Operation Final Testimony. We will meet Admiral Zarketh's fleet at the edge of the solar system and deliver the transparency protocols regardless of cost. If this is to be our final act, we will ensure it serves the cause of galactic freedom. As the coalition representatives dispersed to prepare their ships, Sarah remained in the command center, staring at the galaxy map with its growing constellation of free worlds. 18 days until the enforcement fleet arrived. 18 days to prepare for humanity's most important battle, and possibly their last. Admiral Zarketh's enforcement fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the solar system precisely 14 days after Navigator Veltar's initial warning, arriving ahead of schedule just as the Keplerian officer had predicted. The sight that greeted the Imperial forces was unlike anything in their centuries of pacification operations. Instead of a desperate defensive formation or a planet cowering in surrender, they found the combined coalition fleet arranged in a perfect sphere around Earth, their ships broadcasting on all frequencies simultaneously. 37 vessels representing 17 different species, all transmitting the same message in hundreds of languages to anyone willing to listen. Commander Sarah Chun stood in Deep Sight 7's command center, watching the tactical display as the most powerful military force in galactic history took position opposite humanity's unlikely alliance. The scale was even more overwhelming than their intelligence had suggested. 12 planet-killer dreadnoughts, each one capable of cracking continental shelves. Hundreds of support vessels carrying enough firepower to sterilize entire star systems. Troop transports filled with veteran soldiers who had never experienced defeat. Against this armada, the coalition had managed to field 37 ships of varying classes, most of them damaged from their defection battles, all of them crewed by people who had already chosen death over subjugation. Admiral Zarketh is requesting communication, Lieutenant Morrison reported, his voice steady despite the impossible odds they faced. In the weeks since the rebellion began, Morrison had evolved from a junior communications officer into humanity's primary diplomatic liaison with the Free Galaxy. The transformation reminded Sarah that extraordinary circumstances had a way of revealing extraordinary capabilities in ordinary people. "Put him through," Sarah ordered, knowing that this conversation would likely determine the fate of not just Earth, but the entire galactic freedom movement. Admiral Zarketh's voice, when it filled the command center, carried the absolute confidence of someone who had never lost a battle. His words, translated through their linguistic computers, resonated with the authority of 5 centuries of unchallenged imperial dominance. "Commander Chun of the Human Forces, I am Admiral Zarketh of the Imperial Enforcement Fleet. You will order your coalition vessels to withdraw from this system immediately. Any ships that comply will be permitted to return to hegemony space for loyalty reevaluation. Any that refuse will be destroyed without further warning." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her response would echo across the galaxy regardless of what happened next. Every species under hegemony rule would learn how the coalition chose to face extinction. Every conquered world would judge whether the principles of freedom were worth the ultimate sacrifice. "Admiral Zarketh, this is Commander Sarah Chun, speaking for the coalition of free worlds. We reject your demand for withdrawal. Earth and her allies will not submit to an empire built on conquest and maintained through fear. We stand ready to defend the principles of self-determination and consensual government that your forces seek to destroy." The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute. Sarah could imagine the alien admiral consulting with his staff, perhaps reviewing intelligence reports that had failed to adequately explain how a primitive world had managed to spark the largest rebellion in hegemony history. "Commander Chun," Zarketh finally responded, "you speak of principles while commanding a force that cannot hope to survive the next hour. What logic drives this suicidal gesture?" Sarah smiled, remembering a similar question from Admiral Vextar weeks ago. The hegemony's commanders consistently struggled to understand motivations that transcended immediate survival. It was their greatest weakness and humanity's greatest advantage. "Admiral, let me explain something about the beings you're facing," Sarah replied. "Every ship in this coalition fleet is crewed by people who have already chosen death over slavery. Every captain commanding these vessels has already decided that some things matter more than survival. You're not facing desperate forces making a last stand. You're facing free people who have calculated the cost of freedom and found it acceptable. Dr. Elena Vasquez approached Sarah's station with her datapad, pointing to readings that showed massive data transmission activity throughout the Coalition fleet. Operation Final Testimony was proceeding exactly as planned. Every ship was broadcasting the transparency protocols on all available frequencies, flooding the enforcement fleet's communication networks with documentation of the hegemony's true nature. Admiral Zarketh, Sarah continued, while we've been talking, your fleet has been receiving information that I suspect your government never intended for core world citizens to see. Records of conquest campaigns, economic analyses of resource extraction, internal communications revealing the real cost of your empire's prosperity. I'd recommend reviewing this material before you decide how to proceed. The response came much more quickly this time, and Zarketh's voice carried a new edge of irritation. Commander, these propaganda materials will not affect the loyalty of Imperial forces. We are here to restore galactic stability by eliminating the source of this rebellion. Prepare for immediate bombardment. But even as the Admiral spoke, Elena's instruments were detecting concerning developments throughout the enforcement fleet. Communication activity between ships was spiking as crew members accessed and shared the transmitted files. Power signatures fluctuated as ships diverted energy from weapon systems to process the incoming data. Most telling of all, 3 vessels had broken formation entirely, drifting away from their assigned positions as their crews became absorbed in reviewing the transparency protocols. Navigator Veltar joined them at the command station, his expression mixing hope with concern. Commander, the protocols are having an effect, but perhaps not the one we anticipated. Core worlders don't react to uncomfortable truths the same way conquered species do. They're not awakening to the possibility of freedom. They're experiencing psychological shock as their worldview collapses. Sarah frowned, studying the tactical display as more ships showed signs of crew distraction. What kind of shock? Imagine learning that everything you've been taught about your civilization's noble mission is a lie, Veltar explained. That your comfortable life has been built on the systematic oppression of countless worlds. That your government has committed genocide while telling you they were spreading peace and prosperity. Core worlders are experiencing what humans might call an existential crisis. Elena's readings confirmed Veltar's assessment. Rather than organized mutinies like those that had swept Admiral Vextar's fleet, the enforcement ships were showing signs of complete operational breakdown. Crew members weren't organizing resistance. They were simply stopping work as they struggled to process the cognitive dissonance between their beliefs and the evidence now flooding their systems. Admiral Zarketh, Sarah transmitted, how are your crews responding to their history lessons? Are they still eager to participate in the kind of operations documented in those files? This time the silence lasted several minutes. When Zarketh finally responded, his voice carried a tension that hadn't been there before. All fleet commanders will implement communication quarantine protocols immediately. Any crew member found accessing unauthorized materials will face court-martial. Weapon systems will charge for bombardment regardless of crew status. But the Admiral's orders revealed the extent of his problem. Naval discipline depended on the willing cooperation of trained professionals. When those professionals were psychologically incapable of performing their duties, no amount of threats could restore operational effectiveness. Captain Santos, monitoring the electronic warfare situation from her station, reported developments that confirmed their strategy's success. Commander, we're detecting massive system failures throughout the enemy fleet. Not technical malfunctions, but human factor breakdowns. Command structures are collapsing as officers refuse to relay bombardment orders. Engineering crews are abandoning their posts rather than enable planetary destruction. Sarah realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in military history, the complete moral collapse of a military force. The transparency protocols hadn't converted the enforcement fleet to the coalition's cause. They had simply made it impossible for good people to participate in evil actions once they understood what those actions truly cost. Admiral Zarketh's voice, when it came again, carried desperation poorly disguised as authority. All ships, execute bombardment immediately. This is a direct order from Imperial Command. Any vessel that fails to comply will be targeted as mutinous. The threat was clear. Zarketh was prepared to destroy his own ships to maintain the chain of command. But even this ultimate sanction failed to restore order. Instead of compliance, his transmission was met with responses that stunned both fleets. Admiral, this is Captain Mordak of the Dreadnought Eternal Dominion. My crew has voted to withdraw from bombardment operations. We cannot in conscience participate in the destruction of civilian populations after reviewing the evidence of previous such operations. Admiral, this is Commander Felnox of the cruiser Righteous Vengeance. We are standing down weapons systems, pending clarification of our legal authority to conduct military operations against non-combatant worlds. Admiral Zarketh, this is the crew of Destroyer-class Inevitable Justice. We formally request permission to withdraw from this engagement on grounds of moral incompatibility with mission parameters. The requests continued across multiple ships, each one representing hundreds of Imperial personnel who had chosen conscience over orders. Sarah felt a surge of admiration for beings she had expected to fight to the death. These weren't conquered peoples awakening to the possibility of freedom. They were citizens of the Empire discovering that their government had betrayed every principle they thought it represented. Elena looked up from her monitoring station with amazement. Commander, we're receiving communication requests from 12 different enforcement fleet vessels. They're asking for political asylum. Sarah exchanged glances with Veltar, both of them recognizing the magnitude of what was happening. The most elite force in the hegemony military was defecting not because of conquest or coercion, but because they had learned the truth about their own government. Open channels to all requesting vessels, Sarah ordered. This is Commander Chun to all enforcement fleet personnel seeking asylum. The Coalition of Free Worlds welcomes any beings who choose principle over blind obedience. You will find us ready to work together toward a galaxy where truth matters more than authority. Admiral Zarketh's response was immediate and furious. All defecting vessels will be destroyed as traitors to the Empire. Loyal ships target mutinous units immediately. But the order created an impossible tactical situation, with 12 ships requesting asylum and dozens more refusing bombardment orders. Zarketh found himself commanding a fleet that was as likely to fire on itself as on the Coalition forces. The moment that decided the fate of the galaxy came when Captain Mordak of the Eternal Dominion made an announcement that changed everything. All vessels, Imperial and Coalition alike. This is Captain Mordak, my crew, and I have reviewed extensive documentation of our government's activities over the past 5 centuries. We can no longer serve an empire that claims to represent civilization while systematically destroying it. We hereby declare our ship and crew free of Imperial authority and request to join the Coalition of Free Worlds. The psychological impact was immediate and decisive. The largest and most powerful ship in the enforcement fleet had just defected, taking with it not just massive firepower, but the moral authority to judge the Empire's actions. If the crew of a planet-killer dreadnought couldn't justify their government's policies after reviewing the evidence, how could anyone? Within hours, the defection cascade was complete. Ship after ship followed the Eternal Dominion's example, their crews making the same impossible choice between loyalty and conscience that humanity had made weeks earlier. Admiral Zarketh found himself commanding a handful of vessels while watching the bulk of his fleet join the very rebellion they had come to crush. The hegemony's ultimate enforcement mechanism had become the Coalition's greatest victory, not through military defeat, but through moral awakening. The Empire's own elite forces had judged their government and found it wanting. Sarah opened a final transmission to Admiral Zarketh and his remaining loyal ships. Admiral, you came here to destroy a rebellion. Instead, you've discovered that the rebellion was justified all along. Your own people have seen the evidence and made their choice. The question now is what choice you'll make for yourself. The silence that followed lasted for hours. When Zarketh finally responded, his voice carried the defeat of more than just a military operation. It carried the collapse of an entire worldview. Coalition forces, this is Admiral Zarketh. I am requesting permission to review the materials my crews found so compelling, and I formally request a ceasefire while I determine how to proceed. Sarah smiled, knowing that the galaxy had just witnessed the moment when the greatest empire in history began its transformation into something better. The Human Defiance Protocol had achieved more than resistance. It had shown the universe that truth, freely shared, was more powerful than any weapon. Earth was safe. The Coalition was victorious. And across the galaxy, beings were learning that freedom wasn't just possible. It was inevitable once people decided they were willing to fight for it. The age of galactic tyranny was ending, one awakened conscience at a time.